guys, it's Christa Watson here from Christa Quilts, and I'm excited to welcome you to the Blooming Wallflowers Quilt Along. In this 7-part series, I'm going to show you how to make this entire quilt from start to finish. All you need is a copy of the quilt pattern to join the fun. The version shown behind me was made from an earlier fabric collection. Notice how the offset flowers are all cut from the exact same fabric. In my newer version, I'm going for more of a scrappy look, using fabrics for my black, white, and bright collection from Benartex. I pieced together a fun, scrappy quilt back made from leftovers. Some of them were leftovers from the front of the quilt, and I combined them with other odds and ends to make this really fun pieced back. First of all, I'll demonstrate using regular rotary cutting tools and supplies. This will include some specialty triangle templates, or you can use a specialty ruler. In the second version, I'm going to show you how to cut everything out using my AccuQuilt die cutting system. You can use either method, or you can mix and match as you desire. Feel free to fast forward as you need to. The center triangle of each block will be cut from a triangle in a square shape. The side triangles will be cut from half rectangle shapes that are mirror images. The smaller triangle rulers will make blocks up to 6-inch finished. The larger rulers will make up to 9-inch finished blocks. To cut the center triangles, layer up to 4 strips of fabric. Line up the unfinished block size on the ruler with the bottom edge of the strip. The top blunted edge of the ruler will line up with the top edge of the strip. Ensure that the triangle shape is completely covering the fabric underneath. First, trim the right side of the triangle along the ruler edge. Then trim the left side. Next, rotate the triangle 180 degrees so that it aligns with the freshly cut edge. You'll now be cutting the triangles upside down. Be sure to take this into consideration if you are using directional prints. Cut off the other angled edge to release the triangles. Repeat this motion to cut 4 of the same center fabric for each flower blossom. If there's enough room, you might be able to cut a bonus triangle from each block. You can use this to make more blocks or piece together the leftovers for another project. Stack the triangles blunted side up so they're all ready to piece once we get to the next segment. Cut the rest of the triangles in the same way. Now it's time to cut out the background fabric. Don't worry if you're working with directional prints. The designs will go every which way, and so it's going to add texture and interest to your quilt. It's going to look great, I promise. Fold one background strip wrong sides together and up to 4 layers thick to cut the mirror image pairs. Use the long side of the half rectangle ruler to trim off the edges. Next, place the ruler line with the unfinished block size on the bottom of the strip and the blunt edge aligned at the top. Trim the right side of the triangle stack. Rotate the ruler 180 degrees to make the next pair. Continue rotating the tool to cut the entire strip. It's a good idea to count how many pairs you can get per strip. I'll open these up so you can see what the mirror image pairs look like. If you have extra fabric pieces at the end of your strip, you can layer them wrong sides together to cut additional pairs. Now it's time to cut the background squares. Cut the strips to the width indicated for your size, and then subcut the strips into squares. Use up the leftover fabric to cut your smaller squares for the corner triangles. Cut these on the diagonal only once so that the shorter sides will be on the straight of grain. Cut the larger squares diagonally twice. These will be for the side setting triangles all the way around the edges of the quilt. Because the long side of the triangles will be on the outside edges of the quilt, we want to cut them in such a way that they will always be on the straight of grain. Refer to the Blooming Wallflowers quilt pattern for the size and number of pieces to cut. Now that I've shown you how to cut out this quilt using regular rotary cutting methods, let's try it out with some die cutting shapes. For a list of the specific dies I'm using, make sure you refer to the quilt pattern. The manufacturer recommends that you want to cut out your strips a little bit wider than what you would cut if you were doing regular rotary cutting, but that's okay. I have accounted for this in the pattern, so all you have to do is follow the step-by-step so you know how big to cut the pieces. The manufacturer also recommends cutting along the lengthwise grain of fabric parallel to the selvage whenever possible. I've taken this into account, and where it makes sense to do so, I have done exactly this. However, some pieces work better if you cut them width of fabric, which is the traditional way you're used to. So now, let's get on with the die cutting. I'm using the triangle and a square die to cut the center squares. Layer 3 to 6 single layer strips on top of each other, right sides up. Do not fan fold these or you'll waste too much fabric. Make sure that fabric is covering the entire area of the die each time. Roughly cut off the excess to separate the pieces. I'll throw those small scraps away, but I'll hold on to the bigger useful ones. Flip the entire stack over so that you can line up the angled cut with the die and run it through the machine again. I'm using the Go Big electric cutter, which is really nice because there's no crank to turn and it will cut through the largest dies as well as all of the smaller ones. Keep flipping the stack and cutting one set of shapes at a time until you've cut them all. You'll need to cut 4 of the same fabric triangles for each block. I like to catch the die in my left hand and place everything back on top of the work area to prepare for the next cut. If you slide the mat off to the side, you won't get any static cling. Remember, this triangle is not an equilateral shape. If I rotate the triangle, you can see how it's not the same size on each side. So you'll need to keep track of which side is up. Now it's time to cut the side triangle pairs. Remember to keep these folded in half, wrong sides together. This time I will fan fold each strip so that I'm cutting through 6 layers at a time. Remember to make sure that the entire shape is covered with fabric before you run it through the die cutter. Clean things up by rough cutting off any extra fabric and throwing away the smaller scraps. Notice how each triangle pair is a mirror image. Keep going until you've cut out all of the triangle pairs indicated in the pattern. The leftover ends can be layered and run through the machine again to cut additional triangle pairs until you have enough. Set aside 4 of these leftover pieces so that you can cut out the corner setting triangles later on. Now it's time to cut the background squares that help frame the edges on 2 sides. I'm just using a simple square die for this one, and it still saves me a ton of time. Folding and running through it the machine is so satisfying. By the way, if you're working with a directional print, don't worry about which way it goes. That will just add more texture and interest to the quilt. Now it's time to cut the setting triangles. Place 4 leftover background scraps to cover the smaller triangles on this big die board. You can use a smaller mat since you are only using this part of the blades for now. You'll need to push the uncovered part of the die through the machine since it won't go through on its own. You only need 4 of these for now because this quilt only has 4 corners. We'll use the rest of the long die board to cut out the side triangles on the straight of grain. This is super important when making a quilt that's set on point so that the edges don't stretch out of shape. Rather than starting from squares as you would if you were cutting out using traditional methods, you're going to cut strips that are actually parallel to the selvage. Do not fan fold these. Instead, layer the strips on top of each other to cut 1 pass at a time. You'll notice my mat is wider than a die board, but that's okay. I'm also going to use this mat when I'm cutting out the binding strips because those are also a wider die. I can cut 3 triangles on the board at a time, and I can stack them 4 layers thick. so I can get a total of 12 side triangles in one pass through the machine. Flip the rest of the strips so that the angled ends lines up and send them through the die cutting machine again. I'm sending it through smaller triangle first so that I waste as little fabric as possible. This is a big die board, so I'll grab onto it with 2 hands as it comes out of the machine. Remember to cut off those extra strings so they don't get in the way. Now I'll cut the last section of triangles from the same long strips. This time I can use a smaller mat since it only needs to cover the area that I'm cutting. By cutting them this way, I can get a total of 7 triangles per strip. I'm going to show you how to sew together the triangle in a square blocks. The key is matching up the triangles in a few key places for great results every time. I'm using Aurifil 50 weight cotton thread in a fun color because my fabrics are so colorful and bright. These are all for my piece and quilt collection of Aurifil thread. I've lowered my stitch length to 2.0. Sewing with a shorter stitch length will enable me to press my seams open without worrying about the seams coming open at the ends. I will stop sewing with the needle in the down position, and I engage the hover feature on my Bernina so that I don't have to raise the presser foot each time I stop sewing. I'm using a 1/4 inch patchwork foot that fits my sewing machine. My pieces are all stacked right next to my machine so that they'll be easy to assemble. I always start by sewing with a little scrap of fabric called a leader to catch my starting threads. Now that you've seen how I set up my sewing machine and my workspace, it's time to sew. Flip the side triangle on top of the center triangle. If it has a pointy end, ensure that it's sticking out about a 1/4 inch beyond the blunted top of the center triangle. Use your fingers to smooth everything in place. The blunted tip of the side triangle should stop a 1/4 inch above the pointy end of the center triangle. I'm using a stiletto to guide my pieces into place under the machine. Stitch an accurate 1/4 inch seam. Try not to wobble while you sew. Stitch all the way to the end of the piece and don't veer off at the end. Continue stitching the next set of units without clipping threads in between. This is called chain piecing. Sew all of the units in the same way. Here's a close-up of what it should look like if you cut with a rotary cutter and Tri-Rex ruler. You can trim those tips off later. If your pieces were die cut, match up the blunted edges on both pieces. Here's what that looks like when sewing them together. Sew with a consistent 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way to the end. Continue chain piecing by sewing the entire stack of background side triangles to one side of the center triangles. This will speed up the entire process. This part is very relaxing and meditative for me, so I'll usually listen to an audiobook or quilting podcast while I sew. When the entire stack of units is sewn, grab a piece of scrap fabric called an ender to finish your sewing session. Now it's time to clip all the threads in between each of the units in the chain. I'm using a triangle thread cutter, which greatly speeds up this process. The key to a nice flat quilt that's easy to put under the sheen for machine quilting is having nice flat blocks. To get super smooth flat blocks, I like to press all of my seams open. Contrary to popular myth, this will not weaken your seams and you can still stitch in the ditch. I'm using a hot, dry iron with no steam. First, I use my finger to separate the seam, then press it open from the back side of the block. Then I flip the block over and press it again from the front. Press each and every seam for nice, flat blocks. This really doesn't take me any longer than pressing seams to one side, and I find that my block sizes are much more accurate because none of the excess fabric is getting folded in the seam. Keep going, opening those seams and pressing each one with a hot, dry iron. My fingers are not in the way, so they won't get burned. Use your fingernail to wiggle those seams open as needed. I don't ever starch my blocks. Instead, I starch the fabric first before I ever cut into it. Now that we've sewn the side triangles to one side of our center units, it's time to repeat the same exact process on the other side. Just remember chain piece and press all of your seams for best results. Rotate the center triangle upside down so you are adding the other side triangle in the same manner as before. Flip the background unit on top of the colorful triangle and sew with an accurate 1/4 inch seam from end to end. Here's what that looks like. Remember, if you are sewing die cut pieces, match up the blunted edges. If you are sewing together pieces that are rotary cut, the little triangle tips will extend a 1/4 inch beyond the blunt edge. Continue chain piecing until the entire stack is finished. Clip the threads in between with a thread cutter or small thread snips and stack up your pile to press. When pressing seams open, the light fabric is pressed to the light side and the dark fabric is pressed to the dark side. This prevents shadowing and it eliminates bulk at seam intersections. It also makes it easier to sew patchwork since you don't need to remember which way to press. I'm pressing from both the back side and the front, so my blocks are crisp and flat. You need 4 of each block to make each flower, so stack your piles into similar fabrics. Separate your piles into the colorful saturated blocks and the lighter offset blocks. How we're going to assemble the quilt block units that we sewed last time into this great quilt top. If you have a design wall like me, this makes the layout process so much simpler. But even if you don't, look for a nice flat area so that you can lay out your unit. So make sure you check the pattern, take pictures as you go. You want to make sure everything is laid out in the correct orientation before you start sewing. But you're going to have so much fun, I promise. I've organized the sewn blocks by color onto a table nearby so I can pick them up and lay them out in the correct order. You can enlarge the pattern cover or online image of this quilt and print it off as a visual aid if that helps. Refer to the quilt pattern layout to make sure you are arranging the right number of blocks in each row and that all the background triangles are turned correctly. If you are doing a super scrappy version, take the time to arrange your blocks in a pleasing color placement. It's easy to get these blocks turned around, so just go slow and double check everything before you start sewing. Once my units are all laid out, I took a picture with my iPhone. I'll refer to this as I sew the rows together. For this time lapse, I'm taking off all the units in order and stacking them into pairs so that they'll be sewn right sides together. I'm keeping them oriented the same way the whole time so they don't get turned around. There are a few pieces left on the design wall on the rows that have odd numbers of units. I'll add those on at the end of each row as I sew. My entire stack of sewn units is placed right next to my sewing machine so they are in order and ready to sew. This pin indicates the right side to sew on. That green leader scrap will catch those starting thread tails and prevent a big mess. My setting triangles were die cut so the blunted edges will match up nicely. Now if your setting triangles were cut with a regular rotary cutter, you'll have tips hanging off about a 1/4 inch and those can be trimmed away later. The units are small enough that I don't need pins to match them up and sew. I'm using a stiletto to help guide the pieces and I'm making sure my 1/4 inch seam stays accurate the entire time. I'll sew through this entire stack before I stop and cut the units apart. Now it's time to sit back, relax, and listen to a fun audiobook or podcast while I sew. I'll chain cut them with my thread cutter and stack them back up in order. I won't press any of the seams until the entire row has been sewn. This may look like a hot mess now, but I'm doing a time lapse showing how I sewed every single row. I added all the blocks so each row is fully complete before I press. Now that my rows are sewn, I'll press all of these seams open just like I did for my blocks. I don't like using steam because I don't want to distort my blocks. I also have very hard water where I live, which causes the iron to leak and spit. so I just stay away from water in my iron completely. I'll press all the seams open in the row from the back side. Then I'll flip it over and press it again from the front. I press each and every row the same way. Now that I have my stack of sewn rows, it's time to add them to the design wall again and repeat this process. I like to put the rows back on the design wall after each sewing session so I can ensure that everything stays in order the entire time. I sure get a lot of exercise this way. Here's what that looks like before I start joining the rows. I'll grab 2 rows starting at the upper left and stack them on top of each other with the upper row on top. So each pair will be sewn with the upper row on top. Hold that thought, as later on I'm going to reverse the order next time I do the sewing. I pin my rows with pins sticking out on both sides of the seam. This will ensure my seams won't shift while sewing and the seams pressed open will match up perfectly. Be sure to pull out the pins right before you get to them and don't sew over them. The stiletto helps me keep everything lined up properly. I just pull the pins out and leave them on the machine bed, then use them to pin the next row together. Look how nice and crisp my points are. Now I'll press each section once it's sewn. It's easier to handle these bigger sections that way. I'm opening each seam with my fingers and using a hot, dry iron. Back to the design wall again, laying out my larger sections I just sewed. This time I'm laying out each section starting at the bottom right. This is going to help me reverse the order as I sew. I'll join these together into 4 sets of 2, starting on the lower right. This time I'll stack the rows with each bottom row on top. This will automatically reverse the direction when I'm sewing so that the long rows don't warp or stretch out of shape. Back at the design wall again, and now I only have 4 sections left. I'm so excited, I'm almost done. You know the drill. It's the same process until the entire quilt top is sewn. Now I have just 1 seam left to sew. Once the quilt top, or flimsy, is all sewn together and I've given it a final press, there's one final thing to do. It's called a victory lap, and you've earned it. I'm sewing around the entire perimeter of the quilt to stabilize the seams. I'm using my 1/4 inch foot, but only top stitching about 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. I'll sew around all 4 sides to secure the quilt. This is only necessary when you have seams that go all the way to the edges. If you have borders on your quilt, you can skip this step. I'm really pleased with how my Blooming Wallflowers quilt top turned out, and I hope you are too. I pieced together a fun, scrappy quilt back made from leftovers. Now you might be able to see the quilt top shadowing underneath it. That's because I actually build it on the design wall. I put the quilt top up first, and then I grab all my odds and ends and I kind of puzzle it together to create a unique composition. Now, you don't have to make a piece backing. You can follow along with the Blooming Wallflowers quilt pattern and just make the backing from all one fabric. So the first thing I like to do is sew together any smaller bits that were left over from cutting. To keep track of which direction I'm sewing, I placed a few pins and then flipped the strips as I went, so that reverses the sewing direction each time. This prevents the long strips from warping or bowing out of shape. When sewing together the leftovers, I like to group them roughly by size. I cut leftover fat quarters into random strip widths, which I'll sew together first, since they are all about the same length. Now your leftovers may look a little different than mine depending on how you cut yours out. I may have more or fewer scraps than you do, but that's totally fine. These created a big block from all those leftover strips. I had a few leftover triangles too, so I joined those together randomly into square blocks and rectangles of the same length. I paired these up with some of the background fabric that I cut into squares of the same size. I laid out all of these units into an interesting composition that was roughly the same width of the strip block that I just made. Now don't overthink it. When it comes to math, I don't really calculate or try to figure it all out ahead of time. I just sew pieces together and I trim everything to fit as I go. Placing these larger pieced panels side by side, you can see that they will work nicely together. Now, I'm going to need to add extra fabric on both sides of my first pieced panel so that it covers the entire width of the quilt plus a little bit extra. Now it's time to pair this up with some other leftover chunks and hunks of fabric in similar colors. I love getting comfy cozy in my PJs while I sew, and I'm laying out all of the pieces to cover the quilt top. But I'm also thinking about how I can sew these into pairs of roughly the same size. I don't want to deal with any partial seams here, just easy sewing. Once the quilt top is entirely covered with these pieces, I can start joining the individual sections. This is my puzzle method where I take smaller pieces and join them to larger pieces. I'll press and trim each fabric to be the same length as the piece I'm sewing it to. This will prevent the back from getting all wonky and out of shape. Once each panel section is sewn, I'll place them over the quilt top again to ensure that I still have good coverage. If there's a gap, I'm just going to grab more fabric and add another pieced section. I try to place larger chunks of fabric around the edges since those will get trimmed up the most. For my quilt back, I join the bottom sections together first and then the top sections. It's okay if the outside edges aren't perfectly straight since those are going to all get trimmed away later. Now I'll grab the bottom two panels, pin those and sew those together. Then it's back on the design wall and it's time to join the top half of the quilt back to the bottom half. I'm pinning as I go and making sure that they are roughly the same length. Now this is the very last seam I have to sew and it's a lot of bulk to deal with. So you'll see me constantly adjusting the piece as I sew, trying to keep those edges even. Pressing the seams open and sewing with a shorter stitch length helps everything fit together nicely. Because my name is on all of the fabrics I design, I like to piece in selvages just for fun. It's kind of a vanity thing, but it's also my cheater way of signing my own quilts. Now the piece back is done and you can see the top shadowing through underneath, showing that I made it big enough. You'll notice it's bigger than the quilt top itself by about 5 to 6 inches all the way around all four sides. That's going to make it a lot easier when it comes time to basting the quilt. I'll start by taking the layers outside to spray baste in my backyard. Then I'm going to bring them back inside into my studio to assemble and prepare the layers. But don't worry if you don't have a design wall. You can do the entire process on a table. This whole process takes about an hour, but with some movie magic, I'm going to show you how to do it in a much shorter time frame. I'm using Tuscany cotton batting from Hobbs, and I always take a picture of the batting with my quilt so I can remember what I used. I love getting it by the roll so that I can easily measure how much I need. You want the batting to be a few inches larger than the quilt top on all sides. I'll trim off the batting from the roll with specialty batting shears that cut through it like butter. Next, I'll cut off the extra batting on the bottom, and I can save that for smaller projects or to make up some practice quilt sandwiches. Once the quilt top and backing are all sewn, I drape them on my pony wall just outside my studio so that they don't get wrinkled. Now it's time to spray baste outside with 505 basting spray. It's my favorite because it works great and I've never needed to try anything else. I'm using a plastic table that I have set up outside in my backyard. First, I lay out the backing wrong side up and I spray it on all sides with a light mist. Make sure the adhesive flows cleanly out of the can. I lift up the corners where needed so that I can get complete coverage on the whole back. A piece backing is nice because it's easier to keep track of where I've already sprayed. I fold up my backing wrong side out and set it aside. Next, I spray the quilt top the same way. It's wrong side up and I spray it one section at a time. If you are worried about overspray, you can always use this sheet as a drop cloth underneath. It's okay to spray the quilt layers and then come back to it later. The basting spray will still hold. Using my design wall, I pin the backing up wrong side out. Then I let gravity pull the weight of the quilt so it can flatten out nicely. I'll smooth it out with my hand and I'll also use a long acrylic ruler to reach more of the quilt. I use a separate ruler just for basting and wash it with hot soapy water when it gets a little sticky. I want to make sure the backing is nice and flat and smooth before I add the next layer. Next, I'll attach and smooth out the batting the very same way. The spray is sticky but not stuck, so it's easy enough to reposition any part of the quilt if needed. I don't worry that it's not cut perfectly straight because that will all get trimmed away later. Next, I'll add the quilt top the same way. I'm not worried about lining up the layers exactly. As long as the quilt batting and backing are larger than the quilt top on all sides, I'm good to go. Again, I'm using the long acrylic ruler to smooth everything out. This can also help line up any blocks or rows that are a little bit out of whack. If your quilt is nice and flat and smooth, it will be so much easier to machine quilt. Next, I'll trim off the excess batting and backing, so now there's only about an inch or two sticking out around all four sides. This helps prevent the extra from getting accidentally flipped and stitched underneath the quilt. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's done that. Finally, it's time to press the quilt on both sides to set the glue. I'm using a hot, dry iron with no steam. By ironing the quilt on both sides, this allows you to smush and mesh the fibers together so that they'll cling to each other during the quilting process. It also allows you to work out any wrinkles as you go. And if you need to, you can lift up and reposition while you iron. This is going to ensure that every single inch of the quilt is sticking to every other inch of the quilt, so it doesn't shift while scrunching and smushing it through your machine. I'm using what's called a big board that sits on top of my ironing board. It's basically made out of a piece of plywood covered with some batting and muslin. It makes ironing the big quilt so much easier, and I just move each section of the quilt until it's been pressed on both sides. Remember, if your layers are flat and crisp and clean, machine quilting is going to be so much easier and much more fun. In this segment, I'm going to show you my favorite part of the quilting process, the machine quilting. I'm just doing it on a regular home sewing machine, but you could also do it on a long arm if you wanted to. Now, before I quilt any quilt, I make what I call a quilting plan. This is a diagram of how I'm going to get from point A to point B across the quilt. The important thing about a quilting plan is you can absolutely deviate from the plan, but it just helps you stay anchored and know how you're going to quilt the quilt. Be sure to grab a copy of my books, 99 Machine Quilting Designs, or The Ultimate Guide to Machine Quilting for loads of ideas on different quilting motifs that you can stitch on this quilt. For this version of Blooming Wallflowers, I'm going to quilt 3 different motifs: stipple in the background, continuous curves in the lighter triangles, and rainbow in the darker triangles. But first, let's talk about the overall quilting approach. I'm going to start quilting on the right-hand side of my quilt, and I will fill in the entire first column of blocks with my chosen motifs. These lines just represent the rough area I plan to cover, not the actual quilting design. Then I'm going to quilt the second column in a similar manner. So at this point, I'm going to rotate the quilt and start roughly in the middle where I left off last time. Then I'll quilt the third column of blocks to finish it off. This is a rough idea of the pathway I'll take to quilt my way all the way across the quilt. Now I've zoomed in on the image to show how I'm going to quilt each set of triangle blocks in a continuous pathway. Once I meander my way to each block, I'll start quilting continuous curves. To make it continuous, I'll quilt the arc that's at the bottom of each triangle, then return to the starting point. Next, I'll quilt the remaining 2 arcs in each triangle, bouncing around the block as I go. You can always quilt another set of continuous curves inside of the first set. When I quilt, I'm going to use the same thread color throughout. I'm just changing ink colors as I draw to make the pathway more obvious. Next, I'll quilt a free motion design inside the darker triangle blocks. I'm meandering my way around the entire triangle, one at a time. I'm going to stitch a rainbow motif, and this is my rough sketch of that design. The actual quilting might look quite different, but this gives me a rough idea of where I'm going. Whenever the triangle tips touch, that's how I can pass from one triangle to the next without cutting thread in between. So to make my quilting plan, all I do is take a printout of what the design is, and then I just draw on top of it with a dark marker. You can do something similar by taking a photograph of your quilt top and then printing it off in black and white. Or if you have the PDF version of the quilt pattern, you can just enlarge it and print off as many copies as you need. Sometimes it takes me several ideas until I come up with a quilting plan that I like. Now that you've seen the detailed block quilting plan for Blooming Wallflowers, let me show you how I incorporate that plan into the overall quilting design. Remember, the way I'm doing this is it helps me make my way all the way across the quilt with the fewest starts and stops. I'll start my overall plan in the upper right corner of the quilt. I'm going to meander stipple my way around as much of the background fabric as I can. Now what I'm drawing out is not the exact same thing that I'll be quilting. The density and the scale may be different, but this gives me an idea of how I'm going to move around the quilt from point to point. Remember, any place where the same fabric touches means you can meander into and out of the area without cutting thread. So I'm stippling as much of the background fabric as I can. Then when I get to the first block, I'll pause and begin quilting the block quilting plan that I showed you before. Again, changing colors as I draw helps you follow the plan, but the entire design is going to be quilted with only one thread color. I'm drawing continuous curves in the triangles, and I don't need to draw in all the detail. This is just a reminder to me so that I know what goes where. I can decide how dense the continuous curves will be once I get to the real quilt. I can also decide to quilt the curve on the bottom of each triangle first or last, depending on how I'm feeling when I get there. I can also decide which of the dark triangles I want to quilt first, how to meander my way around each triangle, and how densely I want to quilt the design. These are all decisions I'm going to make as I'm quilting the quilt and as I'm moving and rotating the quilt, so the whole process is a lot easier. Once I stipple my way to the next set of triangle blocks, I'll repeat the sequence. Well, now that you've seen my quilting plan, let me show you how I translate that to the actual quilt. In many cases, I may deviate from how I actually drew it on the plan, but that's okay. As long as I cover the entire quilt, it's really good. And again, you can deviate from the plan anytime you like. So here you can see me quilting the stipple design, starting in the upper right-hand corner of the quilt according to my quilting plan. Right now, I'm stitching at actual speed, and I'm wiggling my way around the quilt to form rounded bumps as I move. I'm using a free motion foot that fits my machine and my feed dogs are dropped. You can use a stitch regulator if you like, but I learned how to quilt without one, so it's kind of what I'm used to. The open toe of the foot allows me better visibility while stitching. I'm also wearing quilting gloves because they help me grip the quilt so that I can move around in a smooth, fluid movement. Now I'm going to speed up that video a little bit. I'll meander my way around the background area until I reach the first block unit to quilt. To keep the quilting continuous, I'll stitch continuous curves in the lighter triangle blocks next. I'm not at all worried about perfection here. This quilt is so busy that you won't notice any wobbles or bobbles as you stitch. It's all about adding fun texture to the quilt. Right now, I'm stitching at actual speed so you can see how I try to keep everything smooth as I work my way around the block. I'm going from point to point, stitching a gently curving line. Now you do not have to hit each point exactly, and you may miss the points entirely when you add more lines. That's perfectly okay. The important thing is to keep the design flowing all the way around the block. So I'm quilting the outside curves first before I stitch the middles. You can really do it in any order or stitch it up as long as you keep moving in the same direction. Notice how often I stop and reposition my hands. I only quilt a little bit at a time before I need to move my hands to another position. Anytime you start to reach or your quilt doesn't feel flat and smooth, stop and readjust so that there's no friction slowing you down. You can make the bed of your machine slicker with a Teflon sheet called a Supreme Slider that clings to your machine while free motion quilting. Once the outside curves are stitched, I'll close the design by stitching the inner curves that will end up making a circle around the block. Now I'll repeat that design one more time to make double continuous curves. You can keep going and quilt a third round of curves, or you can fill in the middle of the triangles with another design if you want to. But I didn't worry about doing that. I just left my centers unquilted. See how I can keep going continuously? The only reason I would stop is if I run out of thread. Fortunately, this fabric is busy enough that any starts and stops won't be very noticeable. Now I'm filling in the background areas with more stippling as I complete each block. Sometimes I'll quilt this area first, and sometimes I'll quilt it in between the two triangle designs. There's no wrong way to do it as long as all of the spaces get filled in with quilting. And remember, the best way to hide imperfect quilting is to add more stitching. Next, I'm quilting rainbows or crescent shapes in the darker triangle blocks. This adds a really nice texture to the quilt. Again, it's going to be hard to see the stitching detail because of this busy fabric, so it's a fun quilting motif to practice, knowing that you can mess up and it's still going to look good. I can quilt the rainbows in all directions. I can quilt them in any size. I can echo and go back and forth as many times as I want to. Just try to fill in the entire area around the triangle while you figure out where you're going to go next. Once those darker triangles have been quilted, I'll fill in any remaining background fabric using that stipple motif again. So here's what it looks like from the wider view of my sewing machine. I'm using my Christa cabinet to hold up the weight of the quilt. This is a wonderful piece of furniture I designed with arrow sewing cabinets specifically for domestic machine quilting. It has a drop-in area so that the machine is flush with the tabletop, and I have a custom insert that fits right around my machine. There's lots of room around the machine to scrunch and smooth out the quilt. There's also an extra leaf near the front of the table that extends off to my left, forming an L shape. This helps completely hold up the weight of the quilt while I move it around. There's also some room off to my right to hold my notions and scissors and other things so they don't fall off on the ground. When I quilt, I create peaks and valleys within the quilt. I scrunch up the bulk all around me, forming some bigger peaks. Then the area right in front of me where I'm actually stitching is the smooth valley. Here's another view from the other side of the machine so you can see how I smooth out those valleys as I go. I'm only quilting the area in between my hands, so my hands sort of act like a hoop or a frame around the area I'm quilting. As long as there's no friction or drag on the area I'm quilting, I can get nice, smooth stitches as I quilt. So I've quilted this quilt starting from the right-hand side of the quilt and moving all the way towards the center. Just be careful when the foot gets to the edge of your quilt that it doesn't slip underneath the quilt top. The little bit of batting and backing sticking out gives me something to grip when I'm actually quilting near the edges of the quilt. Now that I've quilted about half of the quilt, it's time to rotate it. So I'm going to stop with my needle in the down position on the quilt, then scrunch, smush, and rotate the entire quilt under the machine. This is where having 10 inches of throat space on my Bernina really comes in handy. Here's another close-up where you can really see how fun the variegated thread looks on my black, white, and bright fabric collection. I'm continuing to repeat the quilting plan all the way across the quilt. Stipple in the background, curves in the light triangles, and dense rainbows in the darker triangles. If I see that my bobbin is getting low, I'm going to stitch off the edge of the quilt and put in a fresh bobbin. But if something happens and the needle were to break or I'd run out of thread, all I would have to do is pull out a little bit of the thread, tie it off, and keep going. Or I could just stitch right on top of a previous line of stitching, and it's not going to be that noticeable. Trust me, by the time you quilt an entire quilt with these motifs, you'll be an expert at that design. These actually stitch up pretty quickly, and it only took me a couple of hours to quilt this entire quilt. So here is a close-up of the finished stitched quilt. When it comes to machine quilting, don't get hung up on perfection. I like to call myself a perfectly imperfect quilter. I want to be your cheerleader so that you have as much fun making this quilt as I do. In this segment, I'm going to show you how to trim up the quilt and add the binding. Now, it's really fun to sometimes add a contrasting binding, and other times I like to make a really scrappy binding from leftovers. However, with this version of Blooming Wallflowers, I'm going to use the same binding that I used in the background fabric. Sometimes I like to use the same fabric so that it has a nice, clean finish and you don't even notice the edges around the quilt. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the perimeter of the quilt. That's the edges on all 4 sides of the quilt, 2 of the length and then the top and the bottom. I'm going to add that number and add an extra 10 inches just for good measure. For my Blooming Wallflowers quilt, my number ends up being 280 inches. That's the amount of binding that I need to sew together. So to figure out how many strips I need to cut, I'm going to take that number, 280, and I'm going to divide it by 40 inches because that represents the length of one fabric strip that's about 40 to 45 inches wide. So if I take 280 divided by 40, I end up getting 7 strips. I cut out my binding strips using the AccuQuilt big electric die cutting machine and the 2-inch wide strip die. This will make a binding that finishes exactly 1/4 inches on both sides of the quilt. But you can totally cut yours wider if that's what you prefer. Remember, this is your quilt and you can make it any way you like. Next, I join the strips continuously by matching up right sides together at a 90-degree angle. You can mark the diagonal lines if you want to, but I just usually eyeball them. You don't need to match them up perfectly. That excess fabric will get trimmed away later. You can add one strip after another, just like I'm showing here, and the angle of the seam will be the same for the whole binding. After the strips are sewn, trim off the excess triangles with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can rotary cut them or you can use scissors. Again, because you've already sewn the seam allowances do not have to be exact here. The important thing is that the edges of the binding should be smooth. If your seam allowance is off, you can try it again or you can just trim off any raggedy edges. Trim one end of the binding at a 45-degree angle. This will be your starting tail. Then press it wrong sides together with a hot, dry iron. Do this along the entire length of the binding. As you get to each seam, press the seam allowances open so that it's not bulky when you sew it to the quilt. The diagonal seams will also help distribute the bulk so that your binding is nice and smooth and appears seamless on your quilt. I'm making double fold straight of grain binding here, which works for all the quilts I've made so far. Really, the only reason you need to do bias binding is if you're binding a quilt that has curved edges. Now that the binding is ready to go, I need to square up the quilt. That means I'm going to trim the edges of batting and extra backing so that my quilt is nice and flush and easy to sew the binding on. I'm going to wrap the binding tightly around the quilt so it will create a fully stuffed batting, and there's no need to leave any extra batting. Now, if you have a different method of doing your binding and you want to leave extra, you can absolutely do that. Remember, you can change it up any way you like. I'm using a large square acrylic ruler to trim up the corners first. This will ensure that my quilt has a true 90-degree angle at the corners. Now, it's nice if you have a wide border or extra background fabric so that it's not noticeable if you need to trim up a little bit of the quilt to keep it square. I'm cutting all of the batting and backing flush with the edge of the quilt for a nice clean finish. This will help ensure that my binding isn't all lumpy and that it's straight and even on both sides of the quilt. Once I trim 2 of the corners, I'll use a long acrylic ruler to trim the sides. I'll move it along with the edge of the quilt. I can use the ruler and also the lines on my mat to keep the cut nice and straight. I'll just throw away that excess batting and backing, but you can always save it to use as stuffing if you want to. I've machine quilted right up to the edge of the quilt, so it helps stabilize the edges as I trim. Now I'll do the exact same thing for the other 2 corners of the quilt. It really helps to have a nice big work table with a large cutting mat so that you can handle the bulk of the entire quilt. Once the next 2 corners are trimmed, I'll trim up the side again with the long ruler. Again, I'm making sure to match up the 2 previous points that were cut so that the trimmed edge stays nice and straight. Then I'll go back and trim up the other 2 sides the exact same way. Now that my quilt is all squared up and the binding is made, it's time to attach it to the quilt. I'm going to show how I sew the binding to the front of the quilt, wrap it around to the back, and finish with hand stitching. Now, you can totally bind your quilt by machine if you like. In fact, I have a completely separate video tutorial showing just how to do that. So make sure you check out my YouTube channel for more fun things that you can learn and apply to this quilt. Just remember, change things up as you want to because you're the boss of your quilt. But for me, there's nothing better than sitting back, relaxing, and doing some hand binding. I might do it while I'm watching a movie on the couch, sitting by the pool on a nice day. Whichever way you like to do it, it's going to look great. So let's dive in and give it a try. Start with the cut angled end of the binding with the open ends lining up with the edge of the quilt. Leave about 5 to 10 inches of the starting tail unsewn and then begin stitching away from the corner of the quilt, somewhere along one of the sides. I'm using my Bernina dual feed 1/4 inch foot, the number 37D. You can always use a walking foot with a 1/4 inch seam allowance instead. When you get to the corner of the quilt, stop stitching a 1/4 inch away from the edge. I like to fold up the binding to make a crease showing where the edge of the quilt is. On my foot, there's a marking that's about a 1/4 inch away from the edge, so that really helps line things up. Then sew off the quilt on the diagonal. This will create the mitered corner. Next, do what I call the funky fold. Turn the quilt and make sure the binding edges are straight, then fold it up so it's flush with the right edge of the quilt. Fold the binding back down on itself and make sure the fold matches up perfectly with the top of the quilt. If this part happens to slip, your corners may turn out a little bit funky. Continue stitching along the edge with a consistent 1/4 inch seam. When you get to the next corner, repeat the same process. Stop stitching a 1/4 inch away and stitch to the edge of the quilt. That funky fold is what will create the miter on the front and the back of the quilt. The corner will be a little bit bulky, so go ahead and give it some elbow grease and grab onto those threads so that you can start stitching again. Then repeat this process for all 4 corners and sides. When you get back to your starting point, be sure to stop stitching about 5 to 10 inches away from where the ends will join up. Roughly trim off some of the extra binding so that it's not in your way. Now I'll show you how to join the ends so that they look seamless. Take the ending tail with a straight end and lay it flat on the quilt, then open it up. Lay the starting tail with a diagonal end on top of it and open that up too. Then mark along the angled end so that you transfer the same angle to the uncut end of the binding. I'm using what's called a Hera tool, which makes a crease on the fabric. Now you're going to measure and cut 1/2 inch away from this mark to account for both of the binding ends. Use a smaller square ruler that has a 45-degree angle and match that line up with the top of the binding edge, then trim 1/2 inch away from the marked line. Match up both angled ends wrong side together and pin. You'll have about a 1/4 inch triangle tip sticking out on both sides of the join. Be sure you don't get these ends twisted up and carefully move the bulk of the quilt out of your way. Then slowly and carefully sew the ends together with 1/4 inch seams and trim off those dog ear triangles. Finger press that seam open and fold the binding together again. Then pin it back onto the quilt and finish sewing it down to create a continuous loop. You can test to ensure your binding will cover up the stitches on the back of the quilt, and you can roll out each of the corners to ensure the miters are going to look nice and crisp. You'll fold them on top of each other to create the miters in the corner on the back. Now it's time to secure the binding to the quilt. I like to use lots of wonder clips to secure the entire binding at once. I can wrap the binding around to the back of the quilt nice and tight so it won't slip while I stitch it down. I'll put clips on both sides near the corners. Then I'll fold the corner so that the bulk is on opposite sides and secure with a clip at the corner. Once the binding is all secure, I'm ready to hand stitch it down. I like to use leftover bobbins to hand stitch because it's really portable. I'm using a small needle and I'll thread it with about 15 inches of length to work with. Then I'll tie a quilter's knot by wrapping the thread around my needle about 3 to 4 times and pulling the knot through to the end. I'm using 1 strand of my Aurifil 50 weight cotton thread, and it works really well without getting all knotted up. I start by taking a stitch through the back of the quilt and then right in the fold at the binding to hide it. I'll tuck the extra tail ends into the binding. A thimble helps me push the needle through the fabric. I just do 1 stitch at a time and give it a little yank each time. Notice how I'm holding the bulk of the quilt in front of me and stitching from right to left. Now I've seen people do it the opposite direction and that's totally fine. You just want to get comfortable with how you stitch. As I make my way across the quilt, I will remove the wonder clips as they get in my way. When I get to the corners, I like to stitch them closed. I'll take a few stitches on the back side, then push the needle through to the other side and stitch the miters closed on the front. It really helps to use a matching thread to hide all these stitches. The thimble helps push the needle through where it's really bulky at the corners. And this is just a nice touch that really helps secure the quilt and makes it nice and clean. Once the corner is stitched down, I'll keep on stitching to the next side of the quilt. Again, the process is catching the back of the quilt, catching the binding in the seam each time. It's really nice to get into a rhythm and enjoy the meditative process. When I get to the point that I'm about to run out of thread, it's time to knot the thread and secure the ends. I'll wrap the thread around my needle a couple of times and then take a stitch backwards to secure. Sometimes I'll tie another knot and take another stitch just for good measure. Then it's time to start the process all over again. Thread the needle, cut off a length of thread, tie the knot, and secure the stitches in the binding, then keep on going. It usually takes me about an hour of stitching per side of the quilt for a regular throw size quilt. Your timing may vary, so just enjoy the process. Once I've stitched all the way around the quilt and have returned to the starting point, I'll sew a few stitches beyond the starting point to secure it. Then I'll knot and secure the thread tails just like I did before. I really like hand binding because it hides the stitches and gives a nice clean look to the quilt. Now it's all ready to snuggle. I really enjoyed making this Blooming Wallflowers quilt, and I hope that you're following along. Be sure to check the description box for links to all of the supplies needed to make this quilt. You're going to have a great time doing it, I know it.